The Industrial Revolution. Impact on Economics and Society. Lecture terms. We're going to begin talking about the foundations of industrialization and also discuss why Britain was the first to industrialize. Out of all of the revolutions that we are discussing in this course, the Industrial Revolution is an ideological revolution as well as a physical revolution that takes place with events. It is one of the most impactful of the revolutions that we'll discuss because it will change the way life is lived in the world forever. What is industrialization? What we're referring to with the Industrial Revolution is the mechanization of industry in Western nations. It happens in Western nations first and will spread to other nations from there. Along with the mechanization of industry, you also will see that capitalism will expand dramatically as a result. This has everything to do with the physiocrats' call for laissez-faire economics. The notion of the government having no controls over the economy, instead letting the economy run by the regular supply and demand as the natural laws of the economy, that will be the only thing that controls the economy. No false shackles. We also see that industrialization is moving away from what was called the putting out system of industry. Throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period, before mechanization was applied to industries, the textile industry, the printing industry, you name it, all used a putting out system. This is something that really took off in the high medieval period with the rise of the middle class and continued through the Renaissance period into the early modern period. What that means is that it was recognized by many of the middle class who ran these businesses that if they could purchase the raw materials that they needed to create their products in bulk, then they could buy it cheaper. Then they could, of course, produce more of their industry, and then they could make more in the marketplace. The problem was they normally weren't able to, say if it's the textile industry, buy a bunch of wool and spin it into thread and weave it into cloth themselves in a timely manner. So they started to put out portions of the raw material to others who had access to spinning wheels or looms or what have you. I'm using the textile industry as an example, but this was something that could have been done in just about any industry. After the person who either spun the thread or wove the cloth was finished, they would give it back to the business owner, who would pay them a wage, and then he would be able to take it to market to sell. There was putting out piecemeal work to other small cottage industries, and that was how business was run for quite a while. That will change with the mechanization of industry. We see also a change of place for most of the population involved with industrialization. Many will move from the countryside into the urban centers, and this is where we see society moving from an agrarian one to an urban one. Transportation also improves dramatically due to new modes of powering systems. First, we will note that coal is key, and it will be utilized to help power machines as well as transportation apparatus. This will eventually lead to the rise of steam power as we see the invention of the steam engine. This also aids in the production of steel to make the machines for the factories. and the factories themselves will grow as a result of this. The Bessemer process will be part of this change as well. Now that we've discussed an overview of industrialization and what it was, we're going to talk more specifically about how it occurred and where it occurred. Britain was first to industrialize as a nation, and there are several factors as to why Britain was first. I have them listed here, and I'm going to explain them all as we go through them. First of all, Great Britain had the resources needed for the mechanization of industry. The resources that were needed for many industries were found in plenitude in Great Britain. Water could be used for hydroelectricity. Trees could be used for wood to build things, as well as to use for power, a power source. And like I said before, coal as being key. Well, Great Britain had coal in abundance. Great Britain also had the population needed for the mechanization of industry. A workforce was necessary for industry, and Great Britain had a large population, especially considering it was an island country and didn't have very far for the population to spread. Still, Great Britain was more tolerant of immigrants coming in than many other nations were at this time. And ultimately, that will create a large workforce and a large population for Great Britain to draw upon. Great Britain was one of the earliest nations to develop a free trade area as well. The government, that was a constitutional monarchy, had been engaging in what we called evolutionary liberalism in a previous lecture. Slow and steady reforms to not just reform politics in Great Britain, but also to reform the economy. And over time, the economy became more and more free, more and more based on laissez-faire. The government, ultimately, through the British Parliament, encouraged entrepreneurs to build up their industries, because this would, of course, bring more wealth into Britain if they could sell these goods abroad. The government also encouraged entrepreneurs in foreign policy with these free trade zones, trying to encourage them to trade outside of Great Britain to bring more money in. Capital was another thing that Great Britain had in abundance. Because they had encouraged entrepreneurs, they eventually had a large pool of investment capital available from a thriving middle class that could invest in new industries. And this, of course, will encourage the last of the factors I have listed here, technology. Ultimately, the wealth in Great Britain and the expanding middle class, with the expansion of capitalism, will encourage entrepreneurs to develop new technologies, to create new ways to get products made more quickly and to get them to market more quickly. I will give some examples of some of the most important of the technologies that were developed in Great Britain, especially from the textile industry, but others that could be applied to other industries as well. We will use Great Britain's textile industry as an example in some of the following slides. Great Britain had had one of the most dominant textile industries in the world since the medieval period. They were known for their wool textiles throughout the medieval period, but as we move into the early modern period, the demand for cotton textiles became increasingly high and eventually eclipsed the demand for wool textiles. Great Britain had to move with the changes. Great Britain could not grow a lot of cotton themselves, but since they were ones that created a colonial empire rather than just a trading post empire, they were able to draw from those colonies some of the natural resources that they would need for the textile industry to keep up with the demand for cotton products. In particular, They had colonized India and Egypt, and of course, the colonies in North America, especially those southern colonies, they had access to cotton from all of these areas. Britain's textile industry will grow rapidly as a result of this. And ultimately, I'm going to use Great Britain's textile industry to explain the growth of industry as a whole with the Industrial Revolution. Ultimately, what we note is that Great Britain will eventually develop some technologies in order to increase the amount of cloth that they can produce so they can sell it to not just within their own country but to other nations as well. When one takes the cotton, they first have to spin it into thread before they can weave that thread into cloth. But the old traditional way of spinning thread that was done throughout up until the early modern period was to spin the thread on a spinning wheel. It would take one person virtually all day to spin one spool of thread. Then that thread could be taken to somebody who had a hand loom, and they could hand weave the threads in and out, until they finally produced a yard of cloth, which would also take about a day or more. So one of the first of the technologies that was developed in Great Britain to help push the textile industry was Hargreaves' spinning jenny in 1764. The spinning jenny was revolutionized the spinning industry when it came to producing thread. One person could maneuver this machine and spin 100 spools of thread in the same amount of time it normally took somebody on a spinning wheel to spin one spool of thread. Ultimately, it was a huge spinning wheel with many different threads going at once. It was still hand-powered, but still it was much more fast at producing thread than the original spinning wheel had done. After the spinners were able to start to increase the production of thread, over time they would note that it would be better if they had a different way to power the machines other than it being powered by hand or by a foot pump. Human fatigue gets in the way sometimes and causes the slowing down of the production. So eventually they determined, an individual determined a way to apply water power to the spinning machine, to the spinning jenny. Arkwright developed the water frame in 1769, which would utilize a flowing stream and use a water wheel on that flowing stream to create hydroelectricity that could then be used to power a machine. Now, this did limit where you could have your textile factory, but it did, of course, create more energy that could be used rather than just using manpower for the machines. Now that we have so much thread being produced, they needed to be able to weave cloth more quickly. The weavers needed to be able to keep up with the spinners. And eventually, an individual named Cartwright will build a powered loom. In 1785, Cartwright's powered loom will be developed, and ultimately it will increase production of cloth 100 times faster than it was done before by a hand loom. And it could also use the water frame to power it as well. Now, over time, it was determined that they could use steam power to power these machines. Now, ultimately, they would take coal, they would burn it, they would use it to produce steam, and eventually they'd harness this steam in order to build up pressure that they could release under a controlled means at particular times to power the machines. This ultimately started with Watt in his building of the steam engine in 1769. It will not be perfected right away. It takes lots of trial and error. Many of the machines would blow up because the steam and the release of the steam had to be monitored very carefully. But over time, more and more factory owners trusted the steam engines and recognized that not only did it work more efficiently than the hydroelectricity that the water frame used, but it also allowed for more freedom as to where you would build your factory. You no longer had to build it near a natural water source. You could build it anywhere. These are just a few of the important technologies that were developed just for the textile industry. But as we will see in the following slides, some of these would also be able to be used for other industries. In particular, the steam power could be applied to other industries as well. Iron was needed to make the new machines in the factories. And in Great Britain, the smelting iron reforms that were made in the early 1700s ultimately increased the production of British iron. It became the best, the strongest iron that was produced in the world. And by 1840, Great Britain produced 10 times more iron than any competitor in Europe. Since they had an abundance of coal, they could eventually smelt an abundance of iron. Over time, it was recognized that they could take the impurities out of the iron through a different process and create an even stronger substance known as steel. The Bessemer process comes along in the mid-1800s that will exponentially increase the amount of steel that can be produced and a much faster process. Ultimately, steel production became easier and less expensive than even iron production. And once again, Great Britain will lead the charge with the development of new technologies in order to produce this steel. Great Britain was moving so far ahead of everyone in other countries when it came to the production of steel, and then, of course, using that steel that could be applied to many different industries, that there were many countries that wanted to try to find out what the secrets were that Great Britain had. Great Britain had those factors that allowed them to industrialize first, whereas most of the other nations may have had one or two or maybe even three or four of those factors, but not all of them at the same time. And so eventually some of those other nations would send spies into Great Britain to try to find out about the British technological secrets. This, of course, will result in espionage. No other country could keep up because they lacked one of those main factors needed for success. But over time, many of those secrets will be leaked into other nations, and they will start to catch up. Two of the most significant technologies that were developed in the Industrial Revolution were, of course, steel, as I mentioned before, as well as steam power. And ultimately, these two technologies could be applied to many different industries. Machines could be made in the textile industry and in many other industries out of steel. Steam power could be applied to them to make them run. But you could also apply it to many other industries, including transportation. In Great Britain, we see transportation increases exponentially because they were the first to industrialize. Over time, this transportation will develop new roads. There will be new roads developed throughout Great Britain. New canals would also be dug, and new railroads would be built with the iron and the steel processes. Roads, canals, and railroads were all utilized to get products to market more quickly, but they also made it so people could move from place to place more quickly as well. And this is what I meant by a change of place for many people. Many people move away from the countryside and move into the urban centers in search of work in the factories. They now also could travel greater distances more easily because of transportation. And ultimately, this will increase the ability of people to move from place to place and experience an exchange of ideas with people that they might not have ever had contact with before. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people really didn't travel too much farther outside of a 10-mile radius of the place they were born. That will change significantly with the Industrial Revolution, especially with the application of steel and steam power to transportation. If you look at the map that I have on this slide, you'll see the extension of the railway system in England and Wales from 1845 to 1914. You see how greatly it grows so very quickly, and ultimately by 1914 you can barely throw a stone anywhere in Great Britain without hitting a railroad. Now we're going to discuss the development of the factory system and how this development also helped with the expansion of capitalism and how that will also affect societal changes. The development of factories and mass production of goods ultimately is directly connected to the Enlightenment, to the ideals of the physiocrats or the economic philosophes and their desire to create a free market economy, what they called a laissez-faire economy. Adam Smith from Scotland wrote his book Wealth of Nations that was published in 1776 that discussed the notion of laissez-faire actually would aid economies in the long run. If the government continued to put false shackles on the economies and direct it without it allowing it to move according to the natural laws of supply and demand, things would go terribly wrong. And so ultimately he called for governments to keep their hands off, laissez-faire, let it be, in order for the economy to work itself out more efficiently and effectively over time. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith also talked a great deal about piecework, saying that doing piecework in certain parts of the factory system ultimately would produce greater profits. The notion of a certain part or what have you of a particular industry or a particular good that's being produced to be produced by one particular person or one group of people, and then it moves on to the next group of people in order to produce a different piece that would all be put together at the end to create the final product. Piecework, instead of trying to build one thing from beginning to end with one person, piecework would create greater profits. And this ultimately would also lead to the development of mass production with the assembly line, which we'll talk more about on a later slide. Ultimately, laissez-faire was promoted, so there would be no government intervention. And that also meant that the government was not able to intervene to regulate the economy either. This, of course, appealed to the capitalists, to the businessmen who were developing these factories. If there wasn't a governing force requiring them to build their factory in a certain way with a certain number of entrances and exits, with a certain amount of vents for proper ventilation, etc., they could build their factories more cheaply and ultimately they could make greater profits. Without government regulations in the factory industry, however, we see over time this increases the poor working conditions that the workers had to deal with. If the government does not regulate industry, then there's nothing that tells the factory owner that he has to have proper ventilation. And ultimately, that can lead to poor health conditions for the workers who are working in the midst of the exhaust from the machines. Or fire exits. There was no such thing as the government demanding there be fire exits in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, because that went against laissez-faire. So the downside of laissez-faire ultimately could lead to poor working conditions once industrialization started to build and grow so rapidly. The pay was also something that wasn't regulated by the government. There was no government-enforced minimum wage in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, that won't come along for quite some time. And this meant that the workers were basically at the mercy of the factory owners as to what they would be paid. Over time, because there were more workers than there were jobs, as the population grows in places, you will see that when there's more workers than jobs, supply and demand works in that as well. The factory owners can pay less and less to the workers, because if there are 11 people for every one job, the factory owner can pay less. And if somebody doesn't want to work for him for that amount, there are 10 other people who are willing to have any job over no job at all. Ultimately, we will see as we move into the mid-19th century, some of these problems with laissez-faire, the downside of laissez-faire, will start to surface and cause the development of new solutions or new ideas about solutions to these problems. And some of this will result in conflicts between the capitalists and who we will call the socialists. More on that in the next lecture as well. I just want to draw the connection here. All of this also helps to promote the idea of big business. Mass production will lead to the creation of big business. Mass production equals lower prices and costs of doing business. And this will allow for larger profits to be applied to build businesses even larger. Some will be able to corner the market on certain industries as a result of the wealth that they are able to bring in. And some of this had to do with the mass production that was happening. I mentioned the assembly line before. Henry Ford's assembly line that was developed in 1913 will revolutionize the auto industry. The idea of piecework will be applied here. And over time, the automobile will evolve through the assembly line process, with one worker focusing on one part and it moving down the assembly line to the next worker who focused on the next part to build. And by the time you get to the end of the assembly line, there is a complete vehicle there. Other industries will also utilize this same process. And of course, the businesses who are able to do this most effectively will ultimately be able to corner the market and take over that particular industry. This will lead to the rise of big corporations, which will also lead to monopolies. Some of the most significant monopolies that we see in the early years of industrialization in the United States are Carnegie, who corners the market on steel production in the United States. He's able to outmaneuver all of his competition. He develops the strongest and the best steel, and he outmaneuvers all of his competition to where he can take over all of his competition. He buys them out and ultimately controls the U.S. steel industry independently with a monopoly. Rockefeller will do the same thing to the oil industry in the United States, creating Standard Oil. These are just examples of monopolies that happen in the Industrial Revolution. Ultimately, we will see this was possible because of laissez-faire. If there's no government regulation, there's no government rules saying that you can't have a trust or a monopoly. It won't be until much later that we see the development of antitrust laws to try to break up big businesses to allow for more competition. But ultimately, that goes against laissez-faire, the government regulating the economy. So this will not happen for quite some time. Urbanization and migration, the change of place as well as the change of conditions, both living conditions and working conditions. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, urbanization will occur largely with the Industrial Revolution. The moving from a rural-centered society to a more urban-centered society happens with the growth of industry. Ultimately, this also leads to the growth of another thing, the growth of slums. As more and more people flock to the cities in search of work where those factories are located, they are located in the urban centers, they need places to live. Unfortunately, the demand for housing was not able to be adequately provided for. And another thing that laissez-faire promoted was the rise of slums, with slumlords controlling them. Again, there is no government regulation on or building codes enforced, so if you could erect a building fairly quickly in order to house some of these people, you could, of course, capitalize on the demand for housing. This will lead to slums being set up in these urban centers very quickly. The living conditions were horrendous. Oftentimes people living on top of each other, literally. Most of these slums also did not have proper ventilation in the buildings, which ultimately led to poorer health. They also did not have proper plumbing in these areas, which will lead to poorer health as well. Another thing that will increase the numbers of people moving to the cities is immigration. Many people will start to migrate from countries that are less industrialized to countries that are more industrialized in search of work or to make a new life for themselves. We see evidence of this in particular when we look in the mid-1800s at what happens in Ireland. The Irish potato famine hits Ireland in 1854. Ireland was so dependent on the potato crop that ultimately, when the blight hits in 1854, it caused millions to die of starvation. Many Irish will migrate out of Ireland at this time in search of a new place to live, to try to start over again. Many of them will migrate to England itself, and of course, as we know, many of them will also move to the United States. Transcontinental migration will also become more and more widespread as we move into the mid-1800s. We need to note the changes that happen with urbanization to family life. Women and children will start to be incorporated into the workplace, largely because a factory owner could justify paying a woman or a child even less than he could pay a man. And with no government regulation over wages, no child labor laws, etc., they could employ these parts of the population for a smaller price. This will, of course, lead to many industrial accidents with children. Oftentimes, children will be utilized to unjam equipment and machines without the machines having to be powered down. Prior to children entering the factory system, you would have to power down a machine if it became jammed in order to go and unjam it. And then it would take time to build the steam power back up to power it up again. That is loss of production with a machine down for maybe a couple of hours. With a small child being put to work in a factory, they oftentimes could climb into the machines while they were still on and unjam them without having to power down the machine. This, of course, will lead to many industrial accidents, many children losing limbs or even their lives in the process. The cost of living increases as well as urbanization continues to expand. And as the population grows, you see that there are many families that can't afford to feed everyone in their families because of the poor wages that they are bringing in. And this leads to the desire for different birth control measures. And some of that leads to horrendous things as well, infanticide being one of them. Ultimately, you need to note that along with the benefits that comes with industrialization, we also need to recognize the drawbacks. More about working and living conditions in the industrial cities. I'm going to use as an example to explain how bad things could get with rapid industrialization and with absolutely no government regulation, with completely full laissez-faire concepts being adhered to in the economies, the downfall that this could lead to, using Manchester, England as an example. Manchester, England has often been referred to as Shock City to show the downside of industrialization, the social consequences that could come with rapid industrialization with no regulation at all. Many factories in the textile industry, which was one of Britain's greatest industries, pop up in the city of Manchester, largely because Cartwright, who developed the first powered loom, was from Manchester. And so this caused the city to grow rapidly. The textile industry will cause the city to grow so rapidly that the lack of city planning and the anticipation of these massive amounts of people flocking to the city in search of work led to some bad consequences. Manchester is called Shock City because of the effects of these changes. They were most visible in Manchester as an example, but they were around all over. Manchester, however, was one of the first large-scale industrial centers in the West, and it shows you that changes are not always positive. The population explosion caused the city leaders to panic. They could not cope with the rapid growth, and this led to governmental chaos in the city in the mid-1800s. Up to 1840 or so, the city of Manchester was still ruled like a medieval village. Now they have to figure out what to do with all of these massive amounts of people moving into the city. It ultimately results in a massive struggle between the haves and the have-nots. Social struggle between the factory owners, who really call all the shots, and the workers, who are at the mercy of those factory owners. What makes things even worse is that these upper middle class factory owners are also the ones who, because of the Enlightenment, had started to become more and more involved in the government. They were the ones that benefited from the reforms that were taking place in the governments because of classical liberalism, in particular in Great Britain. Over time, the property qualifications for voting for the lower house of Parliament were lowered to include the factory owners. It wasn't just palatial estate owners that could vote any longer. but factory owners ultimately were able to vote. And needless to say, they would also vote for people who would enact legislation that would benefit themselves. So, with the calls for changes in the economy, for the government to regulate the economy by the working class, since the working class had no voice in politics, ultimately those demands fell on deaf ears. Unions were also not allowed in most of the industrial nations until the mid 1800s in many cases. So this will lead to a lot of problems for the lower classes, for the working class poor. Ultimately, it was seen that the working class continued to deteriorate, living in physical squalor that I mentioned before, waste running through the streets, human waste running through the streets because there was no proper plumbing in the areas. This will of course lead to illnesses. Cholera epidemics ran rampant in industrial cities like Manchester. Poor living conditions, poor working conditions. Oftentimes people were forced to work 16-hour days with very little break time, maybe 15 minutes. This will lead to a rise in horrific industrial accidents because of human fatigue setting in. And as I said before, unions were not initially allowed either. And once they were legalized, they oftentimes were difficult to form in any great capacity. I mentioned the fact that nations that embraced laissez-faire economic policies ultimately led to the growth of industry, yes, but increasingly more and more problems for the lower classes, those who were dependent upon the factory owners for work. More and more people leave the rural countryside in search of work in the factories. And over time, there were fewer jobs than there were workers. This happened for a number of reasons. The massive influx of people migrating into different areas in search of work, but also with the development of new technologies that continued to happen in industrial nations. Over time, there was the need for fewer people to run the machines than there were in the past as they developed better machines. Less people were required to run these machines. And this will lead to massive unemployment. As unemployment increases, crime increases in these cities as you have many unemployed people hanging around. Alcoholism also increases. And ultimately, this leaves the city governments in a very precarious position as to what to do about it. Most of the city leaders in industrial centers dealt with the unemployment problem by creating things like the Poor Laws. The Poor Laws come from Great Britain, in particular from Manchester, but other industrial cities as well. But the Poor Laws that come about in the early 1800s ultimately show you how the government favors the factory owners. And I already told you why, because those factory owners are the ones participating in the elections. The working class still have no political voice since they own no property. They have no vote. The Poor Laws ultimately were put in place to establish public workhouses where the unemployed were forced to do manual labor for the city or the state to earn a daily bowl of some kind of mush or gruel. They were usually treated like criminals. Oftentimes they were not given any wage at all, just this small portion of food. They were also not given any time off where they could go out in search of a new job. The Poor Laws and the public workhouses that were created with these Poor Laws ultimately put a lot of the unemployed in a vicious cycle or that they can't get out of. And Charles Dickens was a British writer who wrote a great deal about the deprivation of the public workhouses. We also see an increase in orphans, people who can't afford to raise their children, oftentimes leave them, abandon them, and over time this led to the need for um, more orphanages to be sponsored by these city governments as well. And these are all things that cost money and will cause the increase of taxes to happen as well. More and more people started to feel alienated and dehumanized due to industrialization. Some workers who do not see a way to alleviate their problems blame all of their problems on the factories and the machines within them. They see these as the embodiment of all evil. And this will eventually result in the development of, I guess you would call them, industrial terrorist organizations. One of the earliest were the Luddites that formed around 1810 in Great Britain. They were so frustrated by the plight of the work of themselves as the workers that they started to sabotage machines. Now the word sabotage itself comes from the French word for the worker's shoe. The common worker's shoe was called the sabot, S-A-B-O-T. Oftentimes the workers, because they worked such long hours with so little break, they became so frustrated and tired that they felt the only way they could get a break was to break the machine by throwing their shoes into it. That's where we get the word sabotage. But the Luddites take things a step further in many cases. The Luddites were a group of reactionaries that felt the only recourse that they had to get a relief, if you will, for the working class poor, for their suffering. Their only recourse was to destroy the factories and the machines. Many factories will be set on fire under cover of night by these terrorists, these industrial terrorists. And ultimately, if they were caught, they would be put to death. The government made the breaking of a machine or the torching of a factory an offense that was punishable with death. Ultimately, we see all of this will cause a reaction. The downside of rapid industrialization causes the birth of a new political ism, socialism. We will discuss that more in the following lecture. Thank you.